It was a balmy evening in late October, the kind of night where the air feels almost too crisp and clean, almost as if it's been scrubbed free of the summer's humidity and grime. The moon was full, casting an ethereal glow over the winding coastal road that leads to our small town. I was behind the wheel of my old, reliable Chevy, and I remember feeling a sense of contentment as I drove my two best friends, Jake and Laura, home from a party. It had been a good night, filled with laughter, music, and a few too many drinks for them. I, however, had remained sober, the designated driver for the evening. We had spent the evening at a mutual friend's house, celebrating nothing in particular but the joy of being alive and together. The house was situated on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a sprawling, slightly dilapidated mansion that had seen better days. It was the kind of place that felt haunted by memories of more opulent times, with its creaky floorboards and dusty chandeliers. Yet, it had a charm that made it the perfect setting for our gathering. As we left the party, the laughter and warmth of the evening still clung to us like a familiar blanket. Jake, with his tousled brown hair and easy grin, sat in the passenger seat, while Laura, her blonde curls bouncing with every bump in the road, was sprawled across the back seat, humming softly to herself. The road was deserted, and the only sound was the soft hum of the car's engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. We were about halfway home when Jake suddenly turned to me, his face pale. "I don't feel so good," he muttered, clutching his stomach. I glanced at him, concerned. "Hang in there, buddy. We're almost home." But it quickly became apparent that he wasn't going to make it. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the road, the tires crunching on the gravel. The beach was just a few yards away, the dark, endless expanse of the ocean stretching out before us. The moonlight made the waves shimmer like liquid silver, and the air was filled with the briny scent of the sea. Jake stumbled out of the car, and I followed him, rubbing his back as he bent over, trying to regain his composure. Laura, now fully awake, leaned out of the window, her concern evident in her eyes. "Is he going to be okay?" she called out. "I think so," I replied, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. As Jake took deep breaths, trying to steady himself, I found myself drawn to the beach. The moon was so bright that it almost seemed like daylight, casting long shadows on the dark gray sand. The scene was almost surreal, the kind of beauty that takes your breath away and makes you feel both insignificant and profoundly connected to the world around you. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, an indistinct form lying on a large boulder near the water's edge. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was a person. Who would be out here, alone, at this hour, lying on a rock half immersed in the freezing ocean water? My curiosity piqued. I took a few cautious steps forward, my shoes sinking into the wet sand. The figure didn't move, and as I got closer, I could make out more details. It was a woman, or at least, she appeared to be. Her long hair flowed around her like a dark halo, stirred by the gentle breeze. Her skin was an odd, mottled gray, blending eerily with the surroundings. But it was her lower half that made me stop in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. Instead of legs, she had a tail, a strong, muscular appendage covered in scales that glinted in the moonlight. And on top of her back, a fin, like that of a shark, rose and fell with her steady breathing. I was frozen, torn between fascination and a deep, primal fear. What was I looking at? My mind raced with possibilities, each more absurd than the last. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the truth was undeniable. This was no ordinary woman. She seemed to be sleeping, her head resting on her forearms. In the eerie stillness of the night, the only sound was the rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore. I took another step closer, unable to tear my eyes away from her. In my panic, I turned back towards the car and shouted to Laura, "Laura, turn on the headlights. Quick!" The beams of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the beach and casting long, sharp shadows. I looked back at the boulder, and my heart nearly stopped. She was awake. She was staring right at me, her eyes large and unblinking. They were pure white, devoid of pupils or any recognizable human feature. Her gaze was so intense, so piercing, that I felt as though she could see right through me, into the very core of my being. Her face was like something out of a nightmare. Instead of a nose, she had 6 slits on either side of her face, flaring slightly as she breathed. Her mouth was small, thin, and devoid of lips, giving her an almost skeletal appearance. And her hair. It wasn't hair at all, but something more sinister, moving independently like a nest of snakes. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, paralyzed by fear. But I couldn't move. It was as though her gaze had rooted me to the spot, trapping me in this surreal, nightmarish tableau. Suddenly, she moved. With a fluid, almost serpentine grace, she lifted herself off the boulder, her webbed hands, ending in long, sharp claws, gripping the rock for support. She turned, her tail sweeping through the water, and with a powerful thrust, she disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only a cascade of water and a sense of profound unease in her wake. I stood there, staring at the spot where she had vanished, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just witnessed. It felt like an eternity, but in reality, only a few seconds had passed. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, and then Laura and Jake were at my side. "What happened? Are you okay?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. I turned to them, my legs finally finding the strength to move. I saw something," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something unreal." They looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief, but I couldn't bring myself to explain further. How could I? How could I make them understand what I had seen, when I barely understood it myself? We got back into the car, the rest of the drive home passing in a blur. I don't remember much of what was said, if anything at all. My mind was too preoccupied with the image of that creature, burned into my memory like a brand. For days, I was haunted by the encounter. I replayed it over and over in my mind, questioning my sanity, wondering if it had all been some bizarre hallucination. But the details were too vivid, too real to dismiss so easily. I avoided the beach after that. The thought of going back there, of possibly encountering that creature again, filled me with a deep, unshakable dread. I found myself withdrawing from my friends, unable to share the truth of what had happened that night. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. I tried to push the memory to the back of my mind, but it lingered, a shadow that refused to fade. Then, one evening, as I was flipping through channels on the TV, I saw a news report that made my blood run cold. A diver had been found dead near the same stretch of beach, his face twisted in an expression of sheer terror. The report was brief, but the coroner's conclusion was clear. The man had died from extreme fear. There were no signs of physical trauma, no evidence of foul play. He had simply been scared to death. I sat there, staring at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be a coincidence. The creature I had seen was real, and it had claimed another victim. I knew then that I could never speak of what I had witnessed. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. I've always had a fascination with the paranormal. Ever since I was 10, the mysteries of the unknown have captured my imagination. Growing up, I devoured books and documentaries about ghosts, cryptids, and unexplained phenomena. I loved the thrill of a good ghost story and the eerie feeling that comes with contemplating the supernatural. By the time I was 14, my interest had evolved into a full-blown passion. In August of 2016, my family decided to take a trip to visit my grandmother's farm. Our family roots are deeply tied to a rural area somewhere between Maine and New Hampshire. It was a remote, quiet place, far removed from the hustle and bustle of city life. My grandfather had passed away 2 years earlier, and since then, my grandmother had been living alone on the farm. We wanted to bring some joy back into her life and reconnect with her, especially now that she seemed to have found a measure of peace after his passing. The farm itself was a picturesque place, like something out of an old storybook. It had a rustic barn, a stable, and a vast expanse of land where my grandmother grew vegetables and tended to her flower garden. There were 2 main buildings, the farmhouse where we slept and gathered, and a separate structure where we cooked and stored food. The whole setup was charmingly old-fashioned, with wooden beams, creaky floorboards, and the comforting smell of hay and earth. A dense forest bordered the farm, its tall, ancient trees casting long shadows over the fields. I had always been a little wary of the forest. My parents had told me stories about wolves and other wild creatures that roamed the woods. There were even local legends about werewolves and strange beings that lived in the dark corners of the forest. I loved these stories, of course, but I never really believed them. They were just tales to thrill and entertain. Our visit was wonderful. We spent our days helping my grandmother with the farm chores, exploring the countryside, and enjoying each other's company. It was a peaceful, idyllic time, and I cherished every moment. On the last night before we were to head back home, I felt a mix of contentment and melancholy. I didn't want to leave the tranquility of the farm, but I was also eager to share my experiences with my friends. That night, after a hearty dinner and some family bonding, I decided to retire early to my room. I wasn't particularly tired, but I wanted to watch some videos on my phone before going to sleep. My room in the farmhouse was small but cozy, with a single bed, a wooden dresser, and a large window that looked out over the fields. The window had a big glass panel that let in the moonlight, casting a silver glow over the room. I lay in bed for about an hour, engrossed in my videos, when I noticed that it was around 11 p.m. The day had been long, and I decided it was time to get some rest. I turned off my phone, placed it on the bedside table, and settled into my pillow, letting the gentle sounds of the night lull me to sleep. Just as I was drifting off, a piercing shriek shattered the silence. My eyes flew open, and my heart pounded in my chest. The sound had come from the direction of the forest, a chilling, animalistic cry that was followed by 2 sharp gunshots. Gunshots weren't entirely uncommon in the area. Sometimes farmers would put down a sick animal or scare off predators. But this felt different, more urgent and frightening. I lay there, frozen, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a wolf? A bear? My curiosity battled with my fear, urging me to get up and investigate. Then, cutting through the stillness of the night, came the most disturbing howl I had ever heard. It was a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the air, sending shivers down my spine. My imagination ran wild. I thought of the stories I had heard, the tales of werewolves and other creatures lurking in the darkness. Could it be that those legends were true? I knew I had to see for myself. Slowly, I sat up in bed and strained to hear any other sounds. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, I heard something outside my window. At first, I thought it was a cat or some other small animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. My room's door had a large glass panel, and through it, I could see the faint outline of something moving. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my ears. As I peered through the glass, a shape began to emerge from the darkness. It was a creature, tall and covered in thick, matted fur. My first thought was that it was a wolf, but it was far too large. This thing was at least 7 to 8 feet tall, with a muscular build that seemed almost human. I watched in horrified fascination as it moved closer to the house. The creature stopped just outside my window, and I got a clear look at its face. It had the head of a wolf, but its features were twisted and grotesque. Its eyes were large and round, glowing with a sinister yellow light. Its mouth was filled with sharp, blood-stained teeth, and it wore an expression of malevolent intelligence. As it crouched down, it seemed to peer directly at me, a chilling grin spreading across its face. I felt a wave of cold terror wash over me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed with fear, my eyes locked onto the creature's gaze. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a few minutes. The creature sniffed the air, its eyes never leaving mine, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and loped off into the darkness. I lay there, trembling, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. Had it really happened? Or was it some kind of waking nightmare? I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of them. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and disoriented. The events of the night before felt like a distant dream, but the fear was still fresh in my mind. I decided not to tell anyone about what I had seen. I didn't want to scare my family or seem like I was making things up. But as we gathered for breakfast, I couldn't help but notice the strange looks on their faces. They seemed tense, uneasy, as if they knew something had happened. We said our goodbyes to my grandmother and other relatives, and soon we were on our way back home. As we drove through the countryside, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, lurking in the shadows. The memory of those glowing eyes and blood-stained teeth haunted me, a constant reminder of the unknown. In the years that followed, I often found myself thinking back to that night. It was a defining moment, a brush with the supernatural that left me both terrified and intrigued. I continued to explore my fascination with the paranormal, but I did so with a new sense of caution. The world is full of mysteries, some more dangerous than others, and I learned to respect the boundaries between the known and the unknown. To this day, I avoid the forest at night. The experience taught me that there are things out there we don't fully understand, creatures and forces that defy explanation. While my curiosity about the paranormal remains strong, I now approach it with a healthy dose of respect and a keen awareness of the risks. After all, you never know what might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I've never been one to give much thought to Bigfoot or any of those mythical creatures people claim to see in the wild. Honestly, it always seemed like a load of nonsense, the kind of stories told around campfires to spook the kids. That is, until the fall of 2002. That autumn, my perspective changed in ways I could never have imagined. It was September, and I had decided to take a solo camping trip to one of my favorite places, Mount Jefferson in Oregon. This place had always been my sanctuary, a vast expanse of untamed wilderness where I could lose myself and forget about the humdrum of everyday life. The forest here was a cathedral of towering pines and firs, their branches forming a green canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft, golden glow. The crisp air was filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and the distant sound of a babbling brook. I've always been an unconventional camper. Instead of sticking to the well-trodden paths and established campsites, I prefer to go off the beaten track. With just my compass and my instincts, I'd venture deep into the wilderness, far from the noise and interference of civilization. This time was no different. I parked my car at the trailhead, hoisted my backpack, and set off into the forest, guided only by the position of the sun and my compass. The first day was uneventful. The leaves were just starting to change color, painting the landscape in vibrant hues of red, orange, and yellow. I hiked for miles, the rhythmic crunch of leaves under my boots becoming a soothing background melody. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I found a suitable spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees, and just a few hundred yards from a large creek. The sound of the water rushing over the rocks was calming, and I knew it would provide me with all the water I needed for cooking and drinking. That night, as I sat by the fire, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The stars were out in full force, twinkling like diamonds against the inky black sky. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves as a small animal scurried by, the distant howl of a coyote. I cooked myself a simple meal, enjoyed the warmth of the fire, and then crawled into my sleeping bag, drifting off to sleep with a smile on my face. I woke early the next morning, the first light of dawn just beginning to pierce the darkness. I packed up my gear, doused the fire, and set off once again. The second day's hike was even more strenuous than the first. I trekked for another 5 to 7 miles, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged and difficult. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. I found another suitable spot to set up camp, not far from a bubbling creek. As I settled down for the night, I felt a sense of accomplishment. I had probably covered around 12 to 13 miles in total and was looking forward to a good night's rest. The night was beautiful, with the stars once again putting on a spectacular show. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of the night. I felt at peace, surrounded by nature in its purest form. I fell asleep quickly, the events of the day catching up with me. I must have slept soundly for several hours because the next thing I knew, it was early morning. The sky was just beginning to lighten, and the forest was bathed in a soft, pre-dawn glow. But something had woken me. I lay still, listening intently, and then I heard it, a strange, gibbering sound, unlike anything I had ever heard before. It was coming from somewhere near the creek, about 200 feet away, if I had to guess. The sound was eerie, like a chorus of high-pitched voices speaking in rapid, unintelligible chatter. It reminded me of the way people talk when they're on fast forward, their words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. I lay there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Who could be out here, in the middle of nowhere, making such a strange noise? Curiosity got the better of me. I unzipped my sleeping bag and carefully poked my head out of the tent. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the creek. The morning light was just bright enough to see, but not so much that I was easily visible. I scanned the area, my eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. And then I saw them. 2 figures stood by the creek, their shapes partially obscured by the trees and brush. My breath caught in my throat as I took in their appearance. They were humanoid, but not human. One was covered in black, matted hair, standing about 5 to 6 feet tall. The other was larger, standing at least 8 to 9 feet tall, with pale, grayish-white fur. The larger one was massive, its muscular frame dwarfing the smaller figure beside it. They were talking to each other, or at least that's what it seemed like. Their arms moved animatedly as they made the strange, gibbering noises that had woken me. I watched, transfixed, unable to believe what I was seeing. These creatures were unlike anything I had ever encountered. They had a presence, an aura that was both fascinating and terrifying. My mind raced with possibilities. Could these be the legendary Bigfoots that people had been talking about for decades? The thought seemed absurd, but there they were, right in front of me. I watched them for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. They didn't seem to notice me, and I was careful to stay hidden. I didn't want to startle them or provoke any kind of reaction. The larger creature was particularly imposing, its sheer size and strength making it clear that it could easily overpower me if it wanted to. Despite my fear, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Here I was, witnessing something truly extraordinary, something that most people only ever hear about in stories. Eventually, the creatures began to move away from the creek, their gibbering conversation continuing as they walked. I watched them disappear into the forest, their forms blending seamlessly with the shadows. The sounds gradually faded, leaving only the gentle rush of the creek and the distant calls of birds. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what I had just witnessed. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Part of me wanted to run after them, to see where they were going and learn more about them. But another part of me was filled with a deep sense of caution. These were wild creatures, and I had no idea how they would react to my presence. As the morning light grew brighter, I decided it was best to pack up and head back to the trailhead. I didn't want to risk another encounter, and I felt an urgent need to share my experience with someone, anyone, who might believe me. I quickly broke camp, stuffing my gear into my backpack and dousing the fire. I took one last look at the creek, now peaceful and serene, and then set off into the forest. The hike back was grueling. My mind was preoccupied with the events of the morning, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creatures following me. The forest, which had always been a place of solace and tranquility, now felt eerie and foreboding. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I threw my backpack into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking. As I drove back to civilization, I replayed the encounter over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. I told a few close friends about what I had seen, but their reactions were mixed. Some were skeptical, dismissing my story as a product of an overactive imagination or a trick of the light. Others were fascinated, peppering me with questions and sharing their own theories about what the creatures might have been. One friend suggested that I had encountered an elder Bigfoot and a juvenile, which seemed to make sense given the size difference. He mentioned that sightings of pale, grayish-white Bigfoots were rare but not unheard of, and speculated that the coloration might be related to age. The idea of a Bigfoot community, with elders teaching the younger ones, was both intriguing and unsettling. It was around 2:30 a.m., pitch dark, and way too early for anyone to be awake. But there I was, lying in bed staring at the ceiling of my barracks room at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. My alarm had just blared, a harsh sound that seemed way louder in the quiet of the early morning. Today wasn't just any day. It was the start of a 2-week field training exercise, something we in the military called the field. Honestly, I was one of the few who didn't dread it. Sure, we'd be cut off from cell phones, bars, and, worst of all, showers. But it was a chance to get away from the monotony of daily duties and spend some time outdoors, even if it was in a heavily wooded training area. Dragging myself out of bed, I managed to get ready in record time. Last warm shower for 2 weeks, check. A decent breakfast that didn't come from a mess hall, double check. Living in the barracks had its perks sometimes, and being a short walk from where we had to muster was definitely one of them. When I arrived at the company area, a bunch of my fellow soldiers were already there, looking about as thrilled as kids on the way to the dentist. Some were practically asleep on their feet. Others were downing energy drinks like water. I felt like an old man among them, even though I was only in my mid-20s. Most of these guys weren't even old enough to legally drink, but that never stopped them. We lined up to get our gear and weapons for the training. I felt a pang of sympathy for the guys stuck carrying the M249s. Those things were beasts. But soon enough, we were all kitted out and ready to go. Our platoon leader gave us a brief rundown of what was to come. Follow the vehicle ahead, watch for potential IEDs, and make sure to cover our sectors of fire. It was nothing I hadn't heard before. With a bit of luck, I ended up driving the lead Humvee with our platoon leader riding shotgun, issuing orders like he was born to do it. The drive to the training site took about an hour. We arrived at a secluded wooded area far from the base, our home for the next fortnight. Setting up camp took several hours, but by the time we finished, it felt like we'd accomplished something tangible. Tents were pitched, a fire watch roster was set up, and I drew the short straw for the 3 a.m. guard shift. Just my luck. Standing guard in the dead of night, I tried out the night vision goggles, NVGs handed to me by the previous watch. The woods came alive under the green glow of the NVGs, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace. That is, until I caught 2 privates sneaking off for a not-so-secret rendezvous. I chose to give them some privacy. After all, we were all adults here. But that sense of peace didn't last. As my shift dragged on, and I fought to stay awake, something caught my eye. A figure stood at the tree line, just watching. It was too far to make out any details, but the way it seemed to stare right back gave me the creeps. My wristwatch alarm went off suddenly, nearly giving me a heart attack. And just like that, the figure was gone. I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild, but there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Reluctantly, I finished my shift and woke the next guard, then curled up in the back of my Humvee. Whatever it was, I didn't want to see it again. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what lurked in the shadows of those woods. The next day, after what felt like only minutes of sleep, the sun was already peeking through the trees, announcing the start of a new day. With the previous night's creepy encounter still playing on my mind, I pushed it aside, convincing myself it was just the result of too little sleep and an overactive imagination. Today was about land navigation, something I was actually looking forward to. No lieutenants messing with maps meant we might actually stand a chance of finding our waypoints without getting hopelessly lost. Breakfast was quick, and then we were grouped into threes, handed our coordinates, and sent off into the woods. The dense canopy above us turned the morning light into a sort of perpetual twilight, and the untouched nature around us felt both serene and eerie. The first few coordinates led us deeper into the forest, and each time we found our mark, it felt like a small victory. But when we reached a coordinate that led us to a lone cone in the middle of nowhere, with a photo of a young soldier taped to it, things started to feel off. Who was this soldier? And why was his picture out here? It was a question none of us could answer, but I took a picture of it with my phone anyway, thinking it might make sense later. As the day wore on and the shadows grew longer, we realized we needed to head back before darkness made the woods an even more confusing labyrinth. I remember joking about not wanting to spend the night out there, but the humor was lost on me the moment Carrion, one of my group members, mentioned he thought we were being followed. Stopping in our tracks, we listened. There was a distinct sound of someone, or something, moving through the underbrush behind us. But when we stopped, it stopped too. That's when the real fear set in. Was it just some drill sergeant playing mind games? Or was it something else? We decided against running. It could provoke whatever was out there if it turned out to be more than just a human prankster. Pushing forward, every rustle of leaves had us on edge. I kept thinking about those horror movies where you scream at the characters to do the smart thing. Now I was in one of those movies, and there didn't seem to be any smart option available. When we were about a mile from camp, that's when it decided to make its move. Something darted across our path so fast I barely caught a glimpse. But it was enough. Enough to see its eyes reflecting in the flashlight. Enough to see it wasn't human. The forest around us erupted into chaos as we saw more of them. Eyes glowing, watching us from the darkness. Diaz, another member of our trio, pointed his flashlight at a tree, revealing one of those things clinging to it, smiling that grotesque smile. That's when panic took over. The sound of a gunshot ripped through the air as we turned and ran, not caring about the noise or the direction, only wanting to get away. I don't remember much about the run back. My lungs burned. My gear felt like it weighed a ton, and the forest seemed to close in around us. We were no longer soldiers in training. We were prey, running for our lives. I fired my weapon into the darkness, knowing it was useless, hearing screams that I couldn't place as human or otherwise. Somehow I made it back to camp, alone and out of breath, with no sign of Diaz or Carrion. What happened out there, I couldn't fully explain. But the looks on the faces of my fellow soldiers as they saw me, covered in blood and rambling about creatures in the woods, told me everything I needed to know. They thought I had lost my mind, and maybe I had, but not in the way they believed. Waking up in camp, the morning light did little to ease the horror of the previous night. I was covered in blood, my heart was racing, and Diaz and Carrion were nowhere to be found. The camp was in chaos, with soldiers looking at me like I was a ghost, or worse, a monster. I tried to explain, to tell them about the creatures in the woods, but the words wouldn't come out right. It was like trying to describe a nightmare while still dreaming it. Before I could even attempt to make sense, I was grabbed, questioned, and then quickly restrained. My platoon leader looked at me with eyes full of anger and fear. His questions were sharp, demanding to know what had happened to Diaz and Carrion. I tried to tell him, tried to warn him about the creatures, but it only made things worse. The disbelief in his eyes turned to rage, and then to violence. I was left alone, tied up, wondering if I was the only one who knew the truth, and if that truth would even matter. Time passed slowly in that makeshift prison. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of dread. They sent another search party out, despite my warnings. I knew it was a mistake, but there was nothing I could do. When the platoon leader finally came back, the look on his face said it all. The static from the radio, the absence of any response, the distant gunfire. It was happening again, and this time, they couldn't deny it. They cut me loose, but it wasn't out of trust or understanding. It was out of necessity. The camp was under attack, and every able body was needed. I grabbed a pair of night vision goggles and looked out into the night. There they were, the creatures attacking my friends, my comrades. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. Only this was real, and the fear was paralyzing. I crawled to a Humvee, desperate to escape, to survive. The engine roared to life, and for a moment I thought I might make it. But then, tapping on the window, one of those things was smiling at me, its mouth stained with blood. In that moment, I knew I couldn't hesitate. I floored it, driving over anything in my path, driven by a mix of fear and determination. The drive back to base was a blur. When I finally stopped, I was greeted not with relief, but with suspicion. Arrested and thrown into the brig, I was left to ponder the nightmare that had unfolded. It was only after what seemed like an eternity that they released me, the investigation into the events somehow corroborating my story, or at least enough of it to prove I wasn't at fault. I was medically discharged, a pension and a ticket away from Fort Liberty, away from the woods that held horrors no one should ever face. I moved as far as I could, trying to put distance between myself and the memories. But some nights I can still see those eyes, hear the tapping on the window, and feel the fear that nearly consumed me. It was over, or so I hoped. But deep down, I knew those woods still held secrets, and the creatures within were far from imaginary. My only solace was the hope that no one else would have to face them. But in the quiet of the night, I couldn't help but wonder if the nightmare was truly over. Life after Fort Liberty was a strange adjustment. I relocated to a quiet town in the Midwest, hoping the distance would help me forget. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, the constant anxiety began to fade. I took up a job at a local hardware store, something simple and unassuming. The routine helped keep my mind off the events that haunted me, but the nights were a different story. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in those woods, the weight of my gear pressing down on me, the sound of gunfire and inhuman screeches echoing in my ears. I saw Diaz and Carrion's faces, twisted in fear and desperation, and always, those glowing eyes watching from the darkness. One evening, as I sat on my porch sipping a cold beer, my phone rang. It was Chris, an old friend from my time at Fort Liberty. He was one of the few who had kept in touch after my discharge. We had shared many late-night conversations about the inexplicable events we had both experienced during our service. "Hey man, how's it going?" Chris's voice was a comforting reminder of a life that now felt distant. "I'm hanging in there, just trying to keep busy," I replied, forcing a smile even though he couldn't see it. "I've got some news," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Remember those reports about strange sightings in the woods? Well, I've been doing some digging, and it looks like we're not the only ones who've seen these creatures." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "There are other accounts, from different places. People describing the same kind of creatures, the same eyes, the same behavior. It's like these things aren't confined to one place. They're everywhere." Chris's words sent a chill down my spine. The idea that these creatures were not limited to the woods of Fort Liberty, but were potentially a widespread phenomenon was both terrifying and intriguing. I found a forum where people share their experiences with unexplained events. "You should check it out," Chris continued. "It's called The Shadow Hunters. You might find some answers, or at least some solace in knowing we're not alone." That night, I joined the forum and started reading through the posts. There were stories from all over the country, from people who had encountered creatures similar to the ones we had seen. The descriptions varied, but the common thread was the fear and confusion that followed these encounters. Some spoke of glowing eyes, others of unnatural movements, and many mentioned the sense of being watched. I decided to share my own story, hoping to connect with others who had experienced the same terror. The response was overwhelming. People reached out with their own tales, offering support and understanding. For the first time since that night in the woods, I felt a sense of community. Over the following months, I became an active member of the forum, corresponding with other survivors and piecing together what little information we had. One name kept coming up in the discussions: Dr. Evelyn Harper, a renowned cryptozoologist who had dedicated her career to studying creatures that defied scientific explanation. I reached out to Dr. Harper, sharing my story and the details of our encounter. To my surprise, she responded quickly, expressing a keen interest in my experience. We arranged a phone call, and I found myself both nervous and excited as I waited to speak with her. "Hello? Is this Alex?" Her voice was calm and measured, a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined my recent memories. "Yes, Dr. Harper. Thank you for speaking with me. Please call me Evelyn. I've read your account, and I must say, it aligns with many other reports I've received. These creatures you encountered are not well documented, but they share characteristics with entities that have been described in folklore and eyewitness accounts for centuries." Evelyn went on to explain that these creatures were often referred to as shadow beasts or night stalkers. They were elusive, rarely leaving any physical evidence behind, which made them difficult to study. Her research had taken her to remote locations around the world, where she had interviewed witnesses and gathered data. "What you experienced is not unique, Alex, but it is rare to find someone who has survived an encounter and is willing to talk about it. I believe your account can contribute significantly to our understanding of these entities." We talked for hours, delving into the details of my encounter and discussing her research. Evelyn's insights were both enlightening and unsettling. She explained that the creatures seemed to be drawn to certain areas, often places with a history of unexplained phenomena. Fort Liberty, with its dense woods and isolated training grounds, was a prime candidate. As our conversation came to an end, Evelyn made a proposition. "I'm planning an expedition to Fort Liberty. I believe there's more to uncover there, and your first-hand experience could be invaluable. Would you be willing to join me?" The thought of returning to the place that had haunted my nightmares was daunting, but the opportunity to face my fears and possibly find answers was too compelling to ignore. "I'll do it," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'll go back." The weeks leading up to the expedition were a whirlwind of preparation. Evelyn and her team arrived in town, and I joined them for planning sessions and equipment checks. The team consisted of experienced researchers, each bringing their own expertise to the table. There was Mark, a wildlife biologist with a knack for tracking elusive creatures; Lisa, a tech expert who specialized in setting up surveillance and data collection; and Carlos, a former military officer with extensive knowledge of survival tactics. As we drove towards Fort Liberty, the familiar landscape brought back a flood of memories. The tension in the vehicle was palpable, but there was also a sense of determination. We were on a mission to uncover the truth, to shine a light on the darkness that had taken so much from me. We set up base camp in a clearing near the edge of the woods, close to where the original training site had been. The area was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of wildlife. As night fell, we gathered around a campfire, discussing our plans for the next day. "Our primary goal is to gather evidence," Evelyn said, her voice calm and authoritative. "We'll use thermal cameras, motion sensors, and audio recorders to capture any activity. Alex, you'll lead us to the locations where you had your encounters. Your knowledge of the area is crucial." I nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. The thought of reliving those moments was terrifying, but I knew it was the only way to find answers. The first night passed uneventfully, but the tension was high. We took turns keeping watch, the flickering fire casting long shadows that played tricks on our minds. As dawn broke, we began our exploration, following the path I had taken during the original training exercise. The forest was dense and overgrown, the underbrush making progress slow and difficult. Mark led the way, his keen eyes scanning for any signs of the creatures. We found nothing out of the ordinary, but the sense of being watched was ever present. As we reached the spot where Diaz and Carrion had vanished, a chill ran down my spine. The memories of that night came flooding back, vivid and haunting. I pointed out the tree where we had first seen the creature, its bark scarred and twisted. Evelyn set up a series of motion sensors and cameras around the area, while Lisa calibrated the equipment to capture any anomalies. We spent hours combing the site, searching for clues, but the forest seemed to swallow our efforts, offering nothing in return. As night fell, we returned to camp, exhausted and disheartened. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on our faces as we sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. "Do you think they're still out there?" Carlos asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but I do know that whatever they are, they're dangerous. We need to be prepared for anything." The second night was tense. We took turns on watch, the darkness pressing in around us. I lay in my sleeping bag, my senses on high alert, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs setting my nerves on edge. In the early hours of the morning, just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The others were already awake, their faces pale with fear. We grabbed our equipment and raced towards the sound, the forest a blur of shadows and movement. As we reached the source of the scream, we found Mark standing over a motionless figure, his face a mask of horror. It was one of the creatures, its body twisted and broken. The eyes, once glowing with a sinister light, were now dull and lifeless. The sight was both horrifying and fascinating. We had our first tangible evidence, but the cost was high. Evelyn quickly began documenting the scene, taking photos and collecting samples. Lisa set up the cameras to capture every detail, while Carlos and I kept watch, our eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. As the sun rose, we carried the creature's body back to camp, the weight of our discovery heavy on our shoulders. The atmosphere was somber, the reality of what we were dealing with sinking in. Over the next few days, we continued our exploration, finding more evidence of the creature's presence. We documented claw marks on trees, tracks in the mud, and eerie sounds captured on our audio recorders. Each discovery brought us closer to understanding the creatures, but it also increased the danger. One evening, as we sat around the campfire, Evelyn shared her findings. "These creatures are unlike anything we've ever seen. They're intelligent, elusive, and incredibly dangerous. But we're making progress. We're starting to understand their behavior, their patterns. We're getting closer to the truth." Her words were a source of both comfort and fear. We were on the brink of a groundbreaking discovery, but the risk was immense. The creatures were watching us, studying us, and we had to be prepared for anything. As we prepared for another night of watch and wait, I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. The air was charged with tension, the forest around us alive with unseen eyes. We were no longer just observers. We were participants in a deadly game. And as the darkness closed in, I knew that our journey was far from over. The creatures were out there, waiting, and we were about to face them once again. The night stretched on, an oppressive blanket of darkness that seemed to smother any semblance of peace. Our camp was bathed in the eerie glow of the fire, the flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on our minds. Every crackle, every rustle of leaves set our nerves on edge. I took the first watch, my eyes scanning the perimeter, the weight of the 9mm in my hand a cold comfort. The forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a sinister rhythm that was both hypnotic and terrifying. I felt the familiar chill of fear creeping up my spine. The memories of that night, those glowing eyes, flooding back with a vengeance. "Alex," Evelyn's voice broke through my reverie, pulling me back to the present. She joined me at the edge of the camp, her expression serious but calm. "How are you holding up?" I forced a smile, though it didn't reach my eyes. "As well as can be expected, given the circumstances." She nodded, her gaze shifting to the dark expanse of the forest. "We're close, Alex. I can feel it. We just need to stay vigilant." I appreciated her confidence, but the unease gnawing at my gut was hard to ignore. "Let's hope we find answers before they find us." We stood in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Then, Evelyn placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "Get some rest. I'll take over for a bit." I hesitated but nodded, knowing she was right. Sleep had been elusive, and I needed to be sharp for whatever lay ahead. As I made my way to my tent, I cast one last glance at the forest, the shadows seeming to watch my every move. The following day dawned with a sense of foreboding. The team gathered around the remnants of the campfire, the weight of the previous night's discoveries heavy on our minds. The creature we had found, lifeless and twisted, was a grim reminder of the danger we faced. "We need to push deeper into the forest," Evelyn announced, her voice steady. "There's more to uncover, and we're running out of time." We packed up our gear, the atmosphere tense but determined. The forest loomed ahead, a labyrinth of trees and shadows that seemed to close in on us as we ventured further. The air was thick with anticipation, every step bringing us closer to the heart of the unknown. Hours passed, the dense canopy above filtering the sunlight into a perpetual twilight. Mark led the way, his expertise in tracking invaluable. We moved in a tight formation, each of us hyper-aware of our surroundings. As we reached a clearing, the first signs of the creature's presence became apparent. Claw marks on the trees, tracks in the mud, and an unsettling silence that hung in the air like a shroud. The tension was palpable, the fear a constant companion. "We're getting close," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay sharp." We pressed on, the forest closing in around us. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, the shadows seeming to move with a life of their own. Then, as we reached the edge of another clearing, the ground gave way to a hidden entrance, a cave concealed by thick underbrush. "This is it," Evelyn said, her eyes wide with excitement and fear. "The lair." We approached cautiously, the darkness of the cave a stark contrast to the dim light of the forest. The air was cool and damp, a chill that seemed to seep into our bones. Lisa set up the equipment, her hands steady despite the tension. "Let's document everything," Evelyn instructed, her voice steady. "We need to gather as much evidence as possible." As we ventured deeper into the cave, the walls seemed to close in around us, the darkness almost suffocating. The beam of our flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, a reminder of the creatures that called this place home. Then, we found it. A chamber filled with remnants of the creature's activities. Bones, both animal and human, scattered across the floor. The walls were marked with claw marks and strange symbols, an eerie testament to the creature's presence. Evelyn moved carefully, documenting everything. "This is incredible," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and horror. "We've found their nest." As we continued our investigation, the sense of unease grew. The shadows seemed to move, the darkness alive with unseen eyes. We knew we were not alone. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the cave, a low growl that sent chills down our spines. We turned, our flashlights illuminating the source. One of the creatures stood at the entrance of the chamber, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. "Move now," Carlos shouted, his voice breaking the paralysis of fear that had gripped us. We scrambled, the creature lunging forward with a speed and agility that was terrifying. Mark fired his rifle, the shots echoing through the cave, but the creature seemed unfazed. It was a blur of movement, a nightmare come to life. We ran, the cave a maze of tunnels and shadows. The creature was relentless, its growls and snarls a constant reminder of the danger. My heart pounded in my chest, the fear a cold grip that threatened to overwhelm me. As we reached the entrance of the cave, the daylight a beacon of hope, I turned to see the creature lunging at Carlos. He fought back, his strength and training a testament to his courage, but the creature was too strong. In a blur of motion, it struck, and Carlos fell.
"No!"
I screamed, the horror of the moment freezing me in place. Evelyn grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the light. "We have to go now." We burst out of the cave, the sunlight blinding after the darkness. The creature stopped at the entrance, its eyes burning with hatred as it watched us. It let out a final, blood-curdling scream before retreating into the shadows. We stumbled back to camp, the loss of Carlos a heavy weight on our hearts. The forest seemed to mourn with us, the silence a haunting reminder of the danger we had faced. Back at camp, we regrouped, the reality of our situation sinking in. We had found the creature's lair, but at a great cost. Evelyn's determination was undiminished, her resolve stronger than ever. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice steady. "We need to analyze what we've found, document everything. We owe it to Carlos and to everyone who has faced these creatures." We worked tirelessly, poring over the evidence we had gathered. The bones, the symbols, the recordings, all pieces of a puzzle that painted a chilling picture of the creature's existence. As night fell, we prepared for another watch. The forest was alive with the sounds of the night, the shadows a constant reminder of the unseen eyes that watched us. We knew the creatures were still out there, waiting. I took my turn on watch, my senses on high alert. The memories of the day's events played over and over in my mind. The loss of Carlos a painful reminder of the stakes. The forest seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, the darkness alive with unseen threats. Then, in the distance, I saw them. The glowing eyes, watching from the shadows. The creatures were out there, waiting. I felt a chill run down my spine, the fear a constant companion. As the night stretched on, I knew our journey was far from over. The creatures were still out there, and we were their prey. We had faced them once, but we knew the battle was not yet won. The forest held its secrets close, the darkness a constant reminder of the danger. But we were determined to uncover the truth, to shine a light on the shadows that had taken so much from us. And as the dawn broke, casting a pale light over the forest, I knew we would face the creatures again. The hunt was far from over, and we were ready. The morning sun brought little comfort, its light doing little to dispel the weight of the previous day's events. We gathered around the remnants of the campfire, our faces etched with determination and fatigue. The loss of Carlos was a stark reminder of the danger we faced, but it also fueled our resolve to uncover the truth. "We need to be smarter about this," Evelyn said, her voice steady but filled with a grim resolve. "We've seen what they're capable of. We can't let our guard down." We spent the day analyzing the evidence we had gathered, piecing together the puzzle of the creature's existence. The bones and symbols found in the cave hinted at a complex social structure, a chilling reminder that these were not mindless beasts, but intelligent predators. Lisa worked tirelessly to enhance the audio recordings, hoping to capture any clues that might shed light on the creature's behavior. Mark and I scoured the surrounding area, looking for any signs of the creature's presence. As the day wore on, a sense of unease settled over us. The forest, once a place of mystery and wonder, now felt like a living entity, watching our every move. We knew the creatures were out there, and the weight of their unseen presence was a constant reminder of the danger. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, we prepared for another night of vigilance. The fire crackled, its light a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. "We need a plan," Evelyn said, her eyes scanning the faces around the campfire. "We can. Keep reacting. We need to take the fight to them." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "Agreed. But we need to be strategic about it. We can't afford any more losses." We spent hours discussing our options, formulating a plan that would allow us to gather more evidence while minimizing the risk. We would set up a series of traps and motion sensors around the perimeter of the camp, hoping to capture one of the creatures alive. As the night deepened, we took turns on watch, the darkness pressing in around us. The forest was alive with the sounds of the night, the shadows a constant reminder of the unseen eyes that watched us. Around midnight, the silence was shattered by a low growl, echoing through the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and the 9mm, my heart racing. The others were already awake, their faces pale with fear and determination. We moved cautiously, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The growls grew louder, more menacing, and we knew we were not alone. As we reached the edge of the clearing, the sight that greeted us was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. One of the creatures stood before us, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. It was larger than any we had seen before, its muscles rippling beneath its pale skin. It moved with a grace that was both mesmerizing and horrifying. "Stay back," Evelyn shouted, her voice cutting through the fear that gripped us. The creature let out a deafening roar, its eyes locking onto us with an intensity that was almost paralyzing. I raised the 9mm, my hands steady despite the fear that coursed through me. We fired, the sound of gunshots echoing through the forest. The creature recoiled, a pained scream escaping its lips. As dawn broke, we knew our time in the forest was coming to an end. We had gathered invaluable evidence, but the risk of staying any longer was too great. We needed to return to civilization, to share our findings and seek further help. The journey back was tense, the weight of our discovery heavy on our shoulders. The forest seemed to watch us, the shadows a constant reminder of the unseen eyes that lurked within.